So happy Juneteenth, everyone. I wanted to do a YouTube video, which is going to be on the presentation I gave at my local library about Black Maroons during slavery time. And so this format that I'm going to try out today is going to be kind of like a canned presentation. So I'm going to give the presentation the way I would if, you were sitting with me at the library when I originally gave it. I think it's really important that when we celebrate holidays like Juneteenth, we really know why Juneteenth was important and some of the history surrounding the events. And since I'm I'm a fighter, I'm going to focus on American Maroons and basically how they survived, how they fought, and how they dealt with the evils of slavery. All right, so hope you enjoy. Off the grid Maroon style. So, welcome to the presentation. I'm going to be talking about Maroons in the United States of America, which is a topic not often talked about, but the Maroons usually they associate with Jamaica and also in Brazil, but you also have Maroons in the United States. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the things that they dealt with, some of their strategies, and some of the ways that they fought against the enemies that they had at that time. So the first thing that we're going to do is let's go camping. So with the items on you at this presentation, so if you're watching a YouTube video, whatever you have on you while you're watching, so whatever's in your pocket, whatever's in your book bag, purse, socks, whatever, that you carry on you from a day-to-day basis. If you were to go on a camping trip, how long do you think you would last or be able to comfortably camp with, basically what you carry on you every day, or what your EDC essentially? How comfortable do you think you would live? How comfortable do you think you would be? Do you think you would be able to, in perpetuity, stay out in the woods camping? And how comfortable would you be providing for your kids and family with the stuff you have on your person? So the purpose of this exercise is really to kind of highlight the high difficulty of the situation that American Maroons faced, where essentially when you look at Black resistance against slavery, you have in the United States, you have slave rebellions, you have runaways, people escaping slavery and going to the north or going to an area where there's no slavery, or people can exist freely. And then you have Maroons, and Maroons are kind of fall in this interesting category because Maroons are people that go off and they form their own communities and they live off the grid. And so there's kind of a heightened level of difficulty and a heightened level of self-reliance that a Maroon has to have. So before we even get started, and I apologize for the plane flying overhead, I am outside. But before we get started, let's talk about the evils of slavery. So African slavery in the region that would later become the United States began in 1619, when enslaved Africans were brought to the British colony of Jamestown, Virginia. Chattel slavery continued into the founding of the United States as a nation in 1776 and persisted as a legal enterprise in the United States until the ratification of the 13th Amendment on January 31st, 1865. However, many enslaved Black people would not be informed of this change until much later, such as when Major General Gordon Granger on June 19th, 1865, proclaimed freedom for slaves in Texas, which is the origins of the Juneteenth holiday. Now, let me focus on chattel slavery. So chattel slavery, which is essentially the owning of people and owning of their offspring as well. Chattel slavery committed many evils and hardship on the people who are now known as Black Americans, including murder, rape, mutilation, torture, forced separation of family, denial of education, forced and unpaid labor, bondage, child abuse, exposure to elements, denial of food, clothing, and shelter, denial of health services, and cannibalism. So this is an important slide because we're highlighting right at the beginning, why did these people want to go live out in the wilderness without resources, without support? And it's because they were facing this evil institution. And so, like I said, those three different steps you have the slave rebellions, you have people who went from the South or from an enslaved area and went to an area where there was freedom, so runaways. And then now you have Maroons. So what is a Maroon? A Maroon is a descendant of enslaved Africans in the Americas who escaped from slavery and formed their own settlements. So these people, unlike someone who's running away, they're not necessarily going to a new area. They're going to go live in the woods, the swamps, the mountains, anywhere where they can coexist without having, the slave society basically be able to recapture them. They're creating their own space in the environment. And so that's kind of goes into that camping trip aspect of it, where instead of like, say, if I was in Virginia and I escape from Virginia and go to Philadelphia, the Quaker state where there is freedom and there's able to live as a free Black man, instead, I'm going to go to an area in Virginia that's so remote that I can't be found, or that I'm able to sequester myself and basically live off the grid. So when we're talking about American Maroons, there's two different types of Maroons. And I borrowed this terminology from the books I read, Slavery Exiles. And Slavery Exiles was a really good book because it really broke it down both by time period and also by the different types of Maroons. So the author breaks it down into two different categories. The first category is Borderland Maroons. So Borderland Maroons are essentially, if you think of the slave society as having zones outside of it. So you have basically a periphery where you're off the plantation. You might be in an area where there is less presence of slavers or there's less presence of the plantation system, but you're still close enough to interact. So you're in the woods, but you're at the edge of the woods, or you might be in a cave, or you might be living in a makeshift shelter that, passerbys wouldn't necessarily see you, but you can still go back into that slave society to get resources, to talk to friends and family that might still be enslaved, and you can basically have an interaction still. So Borderland Maroons. So I made bullet points, and these are different aspects of them. So the first one is out of sight, out of mind. Borderland Maroons live close to sites of enslavement. So that's what I was just saying about them staying near the plantation system. It's like, why would they do this? They want to stay next to family. It's hard living just with you can carry on hand. So a lot of times they would raid plantations. By raid, I mean that they would sneak things off the plantation, whether that be tools, weapons, sometimes livestock, food. And they would essentially use the plantation as a way to bolster their resources without being caught. On the land, Borderland Maroons were at the greatest risk of being recaptured and could not afford to make permanent shelters. So unlike the other type, Borderland Maroons really are that minimalist camper. They're living in a hollow out tree. They might make a lean-to, but they're not making anything permanent. There's no log cabins. There's no permanent shelter, because they always have to be on the move, and they always have to be aware of their surroundings, because while they are away enough that they can't instantly be recaptured, they're close enough that things like wild animals, slave hunting parties, and and even just someone telling on them, so someone basically giving them out their location. So either a fellow enslaved Black person or maybe a neighbor or something in that area can see them, and then that can lead to their recapture. So Borderland Maroons kind of have to keep light and keep the ability to stay out of sight, stay out of mind, but also be able to move if someone does come after them. And then the last one is connected to the community. Borderland Maroons were able to stay in contact with enslaved loved ones and raided plantations for supplies with the help of enslaved Black residents. So one of the things that in Slavery Exile that she talks about that's a little different from the other Maroon groups is usually when you have Maroon groups, like if you go to Jamaica or you go to Brazil, when they create their societies, they kind of separate themselves from the larger slave population in the sense of they create their own community, their own people, and then they don't necessarily have the same familiar ties with people who might still be in bondage for several reasons. One, probably because of just like, they have their own identity that they form living out in the wilderness. And two, for safety reasons. They don't want to be targeted as a place where people can escape to and say, well, let's take them out if all of our slaves are escaping to this place. And there's even instances of Maroons sending runaway people back to the slave masters. But with the American Maroons, one of the interesting things is there's this kind of continual sense of community where even when you have people living in the woods, they still can interact with the slave people on the plantation, will help them get resources, tell them where slave patrols are coming by, allow them to get back and forth unharmed. So there's kind of this continual sense, even though you're no longer living on the plantation, we still recognize you as part of the larger community. Okay. The second type of Maroons that was identified in Slavery Exiles is the hinterland Maroons. So if we think of, again, our zones of the plantation, we have the borderland, so that's the edge of the woods. The hinterland is deep in the woods, or even further, so remote that it would be hard to get there even if you wanted to get there. So these are deep, deep in the woods, deep in the swamp, on the top of mountains, in caves, deep in caves. And so here are the bullet points for these people. So exiled by choice, hinterland Maroons lived deep in the forest, swamps, islands, and mountains, and were incredibly hard to reach, even for people running to these communities. They were so deep in the woods, they had little interaction both with the slave society and also with the enslaved population, because they did not go and raid the plantations. They did not go and interact with the larger community in the same way that Borderland Maroons did. Town builders. Hinterland Maroons built permanent settlements because they could afford to, because they were so deep in the woods, deep in the wilderness, that you could build a log cabin, you could build a farm, you could fortify a structure, and you don't have that fear of immediately being discovered. Farms and families. Hinterland Maroons built farms and raised cattle and other livestock. They also raised families in their encampments. So another thing about Hinterland Maroons is they would raise kids in these communities. Some of these were quite large and consisted to the size of maybe small towns. And so they would they would have, town leaders, they would have a code of conduct, they have rules, they would farm, and they would also raise children. And some of the accounts say that these children never knew slavery. They lived so far in the wilderness that they've never seen anyone outside their community. They've never seen anyone of the slave owning class, they've never seen a white person before. And that was something common with the hinterland Maroons, was that they were so isolated that they were just completely in their own realm. So let's talk about some of the areas, some of these wildernesses that they were living in. So one of them is the Great Dismal Swamp. So here's a picture of the Great Dismal Swamp. And if you've been there, the Great Dismal Swamp is really massive and it still exists today. And it's basically in southeastern Virginia and North Carolina, and it's just a big patch of green. I actually had the pleasure of visiting the Great Dismal Swamp a couple of years ago just by accident. I wasn't even researching Maroons at the time, but I was just looking on my Google Maps and I just saw a huge giant patch of green. And I was like, what is this? But these swamps, the name Great Dismal Swamp was actually coined by George Washington. And these swamps, essentially, as soon as slavery began in Virginia and North Carolina, the Great Dismal Swamp was a refuge for Maroons. It's a wet environment. You can canoe in parts of it, but the Maroon communities, the hinterland Maroons, lived on small raised islands within the swamp. And so while most of the swamp is a wetland, there are parts where basically the ground comes above the water level and you can build like a small town or a small encampment. The Borderland Maroons of the Great Dismal Swamp actually stayed near the canals, because the Great Dismal Swamp actually has a bunch of canals that run through it because they have cedar wood that is good for shingles. And so there's a lot of the long history of logging and shingle getting in that area. And so the foreman of these canals would sometimes use Borderland Maroons as labor force because you didn't have to pay them much. And they're not their enslaved people, so they don't really care. And some of the Borderland Maroons would actually trade their labor for resources or money. And so that was the other thing you had, where it's like you had Borderland Maroons actually working for the canal industries in that area. Also, you had enslaved people working on those same canals that would then become Maroons due to the amount of freedom that they had working in the swamp, where essentially you would go out on your canoe and you would have a certain quota of shingles that you had to get. So some people who were just employed as enslaved people in the area were able to become Maroons, have Maroon Taj just by being in the area. That's how great a location this was for this kind of endeavor. The other thing about the Great Dismal Swamp is, like on those islands I said, there were hinterland Maroons that built those communities that were so isolated and so deep in the swamp, because the swamp's really hard to navigate, especially if you don't know where you're going or what you're looking for, that they were able to actually build small farming communities. The other group I want to talk about is the Black Seminoles. And so in slavery exiles, and some of the other sources I read, they actually don't really count the Black Seminoles as Maroons. But other groups count them as the most successful of the Maroons. That's because the Black Seminole organization kind of consisted of almost a nation state. And so first, what are Black Seminoles? So Black Seminoles was a group that was a combination between Seminole Native Americans and escaped and free Black people in Florida. And essentially they created their own unique society where you had contributions from both groups. And the Black Seminoles actually fought a series of wars against the United States for their land in Florida, which, depending on who you're talking to, they actually won, and America actually paid them for their land, and then they relocated to Mexico. And that war was actually led by Andrew Jackson. One of the things about the Black Seminoles was that it was noted by the Union soldiers fighting them that the tactics they were using were not similar to typical Native American tactics, but were Negro tactics. And so I'm assuming that they're using things that they're used to dealing with either slave rebellions or with maybe even African soldiery. So there was a lot of ambushes and a lot of tactics that they were identifying as these being unique Negro African tactics used by the Black Seminoles. So one of the starting engagements of the Seminole Wars was actually the U.S. attack on Fort Negro. And Fort Negro was a British fort that was built during the War of 1812 in present-day Florida, and it was abandoned after the war. And it was re-inhabited and basically rebuilt by runaway enslaved Black people and Native Americans. And they started to basically build their own little settlement around the fort, little small farming community. The U.S. government essentially became concerned that this would create essentially a Black nation in Florida, or a Black Seminole nation state in Florida, and so they besieged and destroyed Fort Negro on July 27th, 1860. And this battle, the Battle of Fort Negro, actually had both sides firing shots at each other. The U.S. Navy came and bombarded the fort, and one of the cannonballs from the U.S. Navy actually hit the ammo storage of Fort Negro and blew the whole thing up, killing everyone inside. But that was just the first battle of the Seminole Wars. After the defeat at Fort Negro, the Black Seminoles started to use more hit-and-run tactics and ambushes that were actually more successful against the U.S. forces and actually caused a great loss of life. And, some people say that the Seminole Wars is the only time that the United States had been defeated on its own soil in a war, because the United States did concede funds and pay for the relocation of the Black Seminoles. It wasn't a forced location, it was by treaty. All right, so we talked a little bit about the different types of Maroons, the Borderland Maroons, the Hinterland Maroons. Now let's talk about some of the hazards and enemies that American Maroons, Black Maroons had to deal with. So first and foremost, slave catchers would probably be the main thing to avoid. In the institution of slavery, human property is considered very valuable, and so there could be rewards up to hundreds of dollars for the capture of runaway enslaved Black people. And so there was always people, either the slave owner themselves or essentially mercenaries, willing to go into the wilderness to try to see if they could recapture these people. Sometimes they were tipped off by people on the plantation, and other times they actually just went out and saw if they could, find these people on their own. So there was always these slave catching parties, and they were usually very heavily armed, and they also employed things like animals, like hunting dogs, and they were mounted. So this is basically a very hardened target, and they're actively pursuing these people. For the most part, this was a concern of the Borderland Maroons, who were still on the periphery between the slave society and therefore had more ability to be recaptured. The Hinterland Maroons were so deep in the wilderness that unless you had a dedicated party that was actively said, I'm going to commit weeks, months of time to find you, they basically didn't have to deal with it. Though there are accounts of, especially with the larger settlements, and there's always this fear in the slave society of a forming of a runaway nation, or there be a large enough population of Maroons that they can come and fight the plantation owners or in the plantation system in their area on their own. So essentially, whenever a community was known to be large, you would see these small armies basically go out hunting for the Hinterland Maroons. But generally, the slave catchers generally harass Borderland Maroons. Dogs and wildlife. So these slave catcher parties would use hunting dogs essentially to capture enslaved Black people, runaway Black people, and Maroons. And these dogs could be quite vicious. They could catch someone, tear them apart. They also could follow the smell, like they use bloodhounds, so they could follow the smell of a piece of clothing or a personal artifact and then follow that person for miles. And so one of the tactics that Maroons would use is walking upstream in rivers and also covering yourselves with certain muds and clays to try to throw off the scent of the dogs and wildlife. But when you're out in the elements, especially when you have limited resources, there's always the danger from the outside world. So this painting, which is called, I think it's called The Hunted Slaves, shows essentially a Black family fighting off a pack of dogs that have been sicked on them. And if you notice the weaponry here, that is a felling axe, and we'll come back to that later. Environment and disease. So another enemy, a major enemy, was living with limited resources out in the deep wilderness. There's a reason why it was hard for people to traverse these areas and why these areas hadn't been picked for settlement outside of the extremes of escaping from slavery. These were hard places to live. And a lot of times, just the environment, being out in the elements, and also catching some diseases without, adequate health care took their toll on these Maroons. And sometimes they would just, die in the wilderness. And other times they would become so ill that they would actually go back to the plantations for fear of basically dying to the environment. But the environment, when you're living off the grid like these Maroons are, is always the first thing you're going to have to deal with. And so that's also part of it too, where it's like these were not easy places to live. These were actually some of the most difficult places to live. And it was even hard for the white slave owning society to navigate these spaces with resources. So let's talk about the weapons of the Maroons. So first, just a little bit of Maroon, I guess, code of conduct when it comes to combat. Generally, Maroons avoided combat. They avoided fighting. For one, because you have a slave society, and there's a famous quote that a slave society is a paranoid society, you're essentially always at a disadvantage. When you fight a slave catcher is generally going to be better armed than you. If you're fighting, a pack of dogs, then, there's generally somewhere that came from. And then on top of that, if you win and you kill the assailant, now you're in a situation where that basically creates a buzz around, where is this person that's going and killing slave catchers? And then they will actually send more resources after you. So the main strategy of the Maroons is just to be completely hidden. I don't interact with you, you don't interact with me, and I'm going to avoid a confrontation if I can, even to the point where there are situations I read about where a Maroon will completely best their attacker and then let them go without killing them for fear of the death being basically put too much heat on them. So someone coming out to capture them or kill them, they'll defeat them, either disarm them or they'll draw a gun on them or something, and then let them go free. Just because that fear of retribution from the slave society, which is paranoid about the ability of what they consider their property being able to fight back. So the first weapon we want to talk about is knives. Now, like going back to that camping trip analogy, it's important that anything you carry on your person, especially when you have limited ability to carry things on you, everything has to be multi-purpose, more or less. So with knives, we have huntsman's pile. So knives can be used for skinning and preparing game, very useful when you're living out in the wilderness. At the ready, knives could be hung on the belt or the hip and carried in hand. These blades could quickly end the fight. If you imagine a Bowie knife, like the one in this picture, sticking that into someone or sticking that into some animal is going to stop them pretty quickly. The other thing is workhorse. Knives could do some of the tasks needed around the campsite, like help gather firewood and in the kitchen. So you can actually use some of these larger Bowie knives a little bit like an axe. It's not as good as an axe, but you kind of have an all-around purpose tool. And so the Maroons equipped with knives would use their knives for everything. They would use them for skinning, preparing game. They use them for self-defense. They would use them for chopping firewood. That is your one-stop shop weapon if that's all you have on you. Similarly, axes were also used as weapons. And the axes used these weren't battle axes or even tomahawks. A lot of times these were, felling axes, hatchets, camp axes, things that they could have gotten off of the plantation. So timber, axes were the best tool for processing wood. I feel like that's self-explanatory. Heavy hitter, while more of a tool than a weapon, a blow from an axe blade was devastating. So a wood felling axe is not balanced to be a weapon, but if you hit someone with a heavy 3, 4, 5 pound axe or hatchet, you're going to do damage. And so while it's not a good weapon, it still has a very powerful offensive capability. And then jack of all trades. Many axes at the period also doubled as hammers or picks. So you have woodsman axes and things that have either hammers or picks built into the back. So that gives more utility. Also, you can actually use an axe for skinning and hunting game, a little bit like the knife, but it'd probably be easier to use the knife. So that's kind of a trade-off. But it's what you can get your hands on. You don't really have the pick of the litter. So, it's whatever you can get offhand. Firearms, probably the most sought after and hardest to acquire. The final word. Firearms had a distinct advantage over all other weapons. If you imagine someone comes at you with a melee weapon and you have a gun, you just shoot them. So firearms gave this advantage, and this is the advantage that the slave owners primarily had over Maroons. So a Maroon armed with a firearm could, on equal footing, fight one-on-one with someone on a slave patrol. And so firearms in the slave society in the South were heavily guarded. And so being able to get a firearm or trade for a firearm was quite difficult because everyone knew that was the power of the area, was being able to have and possess guns. Putting meat on the table, firearms allow a Maroon to hunt game. Now, you can probably hunt with bow and arrow, and you can hunt with a knife, you can hunt with an axe, but firearms allow you to multiply your hunting ability substantially. And then also you can take out larger game from larger distances. So if you're trying to support larger communities, having firearms really can help you do that. Also, the fear factor. So firearm armed Black people were the number one fear of slave owning whites. So there's a psychological factor between the firearm. They knew when slave catchers were going on these patrols, they knew that they were fighting people at a disadvantage. They were fighting people that might have spent days, months, years living in the wilderness, maybe not eating that much food, maybe not having adequate shelter, adequate clothing. And they knew that they were coming in fully rested on horses, with dogs, with guns, with financial backing and support from the larger slave population, slave society. And so the idea that these easy targets, these basically paydays as far as a slave catcher was concerned, could then fire back with their own guns and kill you was really a fear. And to the point where you get people to change their tune when they see that they're going to actually have to fight on equal footing. So, if they see a bunch of Black Maroons armed to the teeth with firearms, they might just flee. Because, the whole psychological thing is like, I am the, slave catcher, I'm the slave owner, I'm going to come in, you might attack me with a knife or something, I can write about it, but I'm going to shoot you before you can even come in distance to me. And it's no real threat to me. But with people armed with firearms, that's no longer the case. Now you're going to have to fight me man to man, woman to woman. And so that put pause, and that is why firearms were so guarded in the society. Other weapons. So when I was doing my research, there were other weapons that were used by Maroons. Swords. So I say swords, a pure weapon balanced for combat with little utilitarian value outside of fighting. Yeah, a sword is a better weapon than an axe, a wood cutting axe, or a Bowie knife. It has more reach. It has, in this era, hand protection, like all the hangers and the cutlasses used in this era have hand protection. So you also have more protection to your hand if you were to get in a fight. And also they're usually faster in the hand. So, you know, someone carrying a sword would be at an advantage over these other two weapons. The thing is, though, when you're living in the woods, a sword is not as useful, you know, splitting firewood or hunting game as a Bowie knife or an axe. And so swords weren't really a popular item with the Maroons. Now, you have some that did carry swords, but it wasn't as widespread. Another thing I found in my research is scythes. So there was a number of incidents of talking about enslaved Maroons, enslaved Black people using scythes actually to fight dogs. If you think of a dog as kind of being a low target near your legs, a scythe is used to cut grass, and so they would use straight-handled scythes actually to fight dogs, either wound them by cutting at the legs or at the body of the dog, and usually that was enough to scare them off. And if it didn't scare them off, the scythe was actually adequate to kill the dog as well. And funny enough, another surprising thing I learned about is that in the Great Dismal Swamp, there were evidence of people making early makeshift bulletproof vests using turkey feathers. Funny enough. And you know, if you look in the history of bulletproof vests, textiles, heavy textiles, leathers, things like that were the early forms of it. So in this picture, I have a picture of a Civil War bulletproof vest, because this technology was kind of being developed during the Civil War. And so I don't have an image of the Maroon version of it, but just kind of get an idea of what something at that era would look like. So the final part of this presentation, since this was a live presentation, was this demo game. And so essentially, I wanted to simulate a knife fight for people who didn't have equipment. And so this was a balloon game. Step one was to grab your weapon. I had a table full of weapons of the era. So I had axe trainers, saber trainers, Bowie knife trainers, and essentially you race to pop a balloon before your opponent pops their balloon. And this was like to simulate a knife fight, and the balloon would move around and stuff, so it'd be difficult. So step one, grab your weapon from the table. Step two, face your opponent. Step three, pop their balloon before they pop yours. For people who are already in the sword arts, if you want to do something for Juneteenth, you might want to try sparring on Bowie knife versus saber, or axe versus bayonet, and kind of get into that era and kind of put someone with a weapon of disadvantage against someone with a weapon of advantage, to kind of get the idea of what a fight against a slave catcher might entail, where you are using essentially your jack of all trades, multi-purpose tool against a prepared armed combatant. Well, that's the end of my presentation. So the final slide, end of an era. We have Juneteenth, the Civil War ends, and slavery is outlawed, even though some people find out later than others. But it's important to learn about these things to kind of know, like I said, why it was important that slavery ended, and some of the things that the Black people who had to deal with the evils of slavery went through, and one of the forms of resistance against slavery that's not often talking about, which is Maroontage. All right. Well, thank you for watching my presentation. I hope you learned, and please post any questions you have. I'll put all the books that I use in the description of this video, and have a nice day.